Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the Dairy Signal. I'm excited to dive into manure spills and incidents here with Kevin in just a moment, but I want to say thank you for joining us here. I know we had a week hiatus as we were all at business conference, so thank you to those who were joining us there in person. If you didn't have a chance to make it there in person, we definitely missed you. It was one for the books. I have had so much fun at all the business conferences I have been to, but I think this is one. This is one that'll take the cake for a while. So we're excited though to be able to join you here in this virtual setting though this week after business conference to dive into something that we kind of went through it in one of the learning lounges, but we have the option or opportunity, I should say, to really dive into it a little bit more here with questions from you all. If you are watching live, you can ask your questions by hitting the bottom right hand corner. There's three little dots. Hit that, and you'll be able to type your questions in whenever you so choose throughout today's episode. But joining us here this afternoon, we have Kevin Erb, who's a program manager with the Conservation Professional Training Program at UW-Madison. And Kevin, we're excited to have you back on here. But before we dive into the topic of the day here, manure spills and incidents, would you mind giving our audience just a little bit about yourself before we begin?
So definitely can. By the way, really enjoyed the business conference as well. It was a really good opportunity to see things in the Hall of Ideas and connect with dairy folks, not only from around Wisconsin, but from around the U.S. as well. So been with Extension now almost 34 years, grew up on a small 400-acre small beef operation in central Illinois. The family had moved from dairy into beef in the late 1960s. And that's kind of my background. My parents actually ran a manure hauling business when I was a kid. I said I'm getting as far away from this SHIT as I can. And 30 some years later, here I am. It's a good part of my career, but also a really neat thing about the livestock industry in general is we're creating a resource that we can use, but also one we have to be very careful with as well.
Well, it's funny how the world sometimes comes full circle,
Yes, it
uh,
is.
especially as yet going into today's conversation. So, Kevin, I know we've got some good information to get through here today, so I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started. But we'll be asking questions if they pertain throughout, and if folks have questions that come through here. So, without further ado, take it away, and we can get started here.
And if we get questions that are good in the middle, feel free to interrupt me, Amber. I'd rather answer them when the topic is hot than to save to the end. We will be a little bit short today in terms of the time, so we have plenty of time at the end for questions. So with that, we'll go ahead and dive in here. And there's really two different projects I want to spend a few minutes talking about today. The primary one is our manure spill research project. And so every 5 years, I bring in a college student, and that person and I go through all of the DNR records, all of the County Land and Water Conservation Department records, and even some social media documentation, really to get a handle on what's happening with manure spills, what are the root causes, because if we can figure out what the root causes are, we can take action steps to prevent them from happening. The other project, and I'll actually start off with this one first today, is really looking at the impact of regulations on winter manure spreading in wells in the Silurian, particularly pathogens, E. coli, rotavirus, and cryptosporidium, some of those, and brown water incidents in water wells as well. So just a quick high-level overview for those of you that aren't familiar, aren't from eastern Wisconsin. So if we look at the counties that are closest to Lake Michigan, we have what's called the Niagara Escarpment or the Silurian bedrock. That's actually the same rock formation, Amber, that Niagara Falls flows over. And it's a limestone that goes up into, it's kind of neat because it really ties into the dairy areas, not only here in Wisconsin, but also the heavy dairy areas in Ontario and New York State as well. But it basically arcs from about the Milwaukee area, the Illinois border, up through Door County. Door County is a rock peninsula, basically, into Upper Michigan, Ontario, back into New York as well. The challenge with this rock formation that's underneath our soils is that it's got fractures, and over time, rainwater going through those has dissolved those cracks, and so we see a very flashy system. And so the area and the map on the right here, you'll see the colored dots are the areas where we have that fractured bedrock less than 20 feet over the surface or under the surface of the soil. The photos on the right are really showing some of the concerns that we would have in this area. So the one on the upper left there is actually a sinkhole that's in a road ditch. We actually, in the photo, show both manure runoff coming into that from a field, but also sediment from a new house construction, urban sprawl as well, contaminating the well water. Below that, there with the white barn and the harvest store in the background, just an example of a bedrock outcrop that we have, in this case, in somebody's yard, not in a field. And then in that lower right-hand photo are what we call fracture traces. So that alfalfa field on the right, uh, where the alfalfa is green in that fractured glass pattern, the roots actually go down several feet into the soil that's fallen into those cracks, more access to nutrients and moisture. In between there, the alfalfa, there's less than 3 feet of soil here. So in August, stunted, yellow, really not producing that well. Now, those cracks generally above those is where these sinkholes form. But anytime I've got that shallow surface, I've got a fairly high risk of manure and other contaminants getting into people's wells. Just some illustrations of what that actually looks like, what we call brown water incidences, where runoff from farm fields, whether it has manure or not, enters into a sinkhole, goes down through the thin soils into those cracks. And this is what we end up with. This is a situation in Calumet County, Wisconsin in 2014. But obviously, for homeowners, whether you're a homeowner, whether your cows are drinking from this is a water quality concern to be aware of. And so back in 2006, in a single township here in Brown County, Wisconsin, in the Green Bay area, we had over 80 wells that were contaminated in a 3 month period in February. And so as a result, there was a group of farmers, agency staff, other folks that got together, created what was called the Karst Task Force. That group came up with a lot of very good recommendations, like a lot of government reports, those got put on a shelf and ignored for a while. But we did have two county land and water, soil and water conservation districts that basically said, okay, we're going to see what we can do by implementing winter spreading plans. And so basically, yeah, livestock farms can still spread manure in the winter, but it needs to be done in a way that reduces the risk on the lowest risk fields. We had three counties, Calumet, Door, and Kewaunee, that did not. So basically, we had a nice paired study. So in 2015, we went in, did a before and after analysis. We had 7 years of data from the DNR, from county health departments, from soil and water districts. What's the contamination event driven before and after? So 14 years worth of data, and statistically, we saw a significant difference where farmers made minor changes in land application. We saw a statistically significant drop in contamination, both pathogens and brown water incidences. Didn't eliminate them, but we knew we were on the right track. And so in 2025, we updated that study to include a couple of things. So statewide, NR 151 was changed, that basically restricted winter manure application in those shallow bedrock areas. Kewaunee County put their ordinance in place. And we had a lot of farmers, the farmer-led groups, a lot of good, positive things, voluntary changes in what farmers are doing. And we were able to add in another county's worth of data. So now I've got 24 years of data before and after winter spreading plans, and then after implementation of the regulatory changes and the changes farmers made voluntarily. And so I think the big thing here is there's really good news out of this. So event-driven manure-related incidences are no longer occurring. So we saw a limited number in 2015 to 2019 as farmers changed, adapted their practices. We also know 2018, 2019 were incredibly wet years for us as well. But once we got after January 1st of 2020, we have not seen in these five counties a single documented case of manure-related pathogens in people's wells or brown water instances. So the voluntary changes, the regulations that have been put in place are effective. Not to say it still can't happen. There's some research studies that show a little bit of contamination still occurring, but by and large, the positive thing here is the changes the livestock industry have really made a difference, and we're not seeing those contamination instances happening anymore.
So, Kevin, before we move on from that, I just want
Yep,
to have a comment and a question for you here. It's really interesting, and it really goes to show that water quality has been on producers' minds. I mean, I know it's
yep.
been on public mind as well, but through the combination of changes, it's turned a good direction, especially in those areas. Is there a certain reason that you would say has contributed to really this push that ultimately has really had positive impact on this region? Or was it just that it was over a period of time and during that time frame there was a mentality shift that ultimately led to the results we're seeing today?
I think there was a mentality shift, but I also think there was a greater awareness both among farmers and manure applicators and their employees that they were able to recognize these higher risk situations and take steps to mitigate the problem. And I think, as you'll hear me say a little bit later on, if it's predictable, it's preventable. And so knowing where the risk factors are, knowing what we can do to prevent problems, we can very easily implement simple steps and avoid the being the lead story on the 6 o'clock news. I mean, the last thing we want is TV footage, and we've had it before, of manure coming out of people's kitchen faucets. We've had photos of bits of toilet paper coming out of kitchen faucets. I mean, that's this sensitive geologic area that we have here. But I think the big take home, like you said, is farmers are making a difference. And we need to continue to make progress. We can't just go back to the ways that we were doing things, always being aware and always being proactive.
It really is to the testament. If you know better, you do better, it feels like in
Yep.
this case, which is really, really good to hear. I'll let you keep going on because I know we got more to talk about, but I
Yep.
wanted to make that thought or that comment
Yep.
here in between as we go.
Yep, and I do want to acknowledge the previous study. Ashley Mensch was the student that really helped me pull that data together, and she's done the majority of the work. Now we're going to move into manure spills, and I acknowledge the students that have helped me over the last 20 years with this as well. Cooper Price from Penn State University is the one, the last 5 years of data that's really pulled a whole lot of that together here. But we're going to talk about what we've seen in terms of trends over the last 5 to 10 years, and really some good take-home lessons that we can use to prevent problems on our own farms. So just a bit of quick background. So this is a joint University of Wisconsin-Madison extension and Wisconsin DNR project. So every 5 years, we go through all of the publicly available records from DNR, from county land and water, soil and water districts. We look to identify those common causes and put together that list of very good prevention strategies. And for those that were at the business conference, in the proceedings is a very nice 2-page document that really summarizes a lot of these things. And I think it's an excellent resource for farms to be using. I will acknowledge the study was funded in part by Wisconsin's Manure Applicator Association, used to be the Professional Nutrient Applicators Association of Wisconsin, PNAW. That's now merging in with the Wisconsin Custom Operators. So for these projects, we use a little bit different definition than the regulatory agencies do when it comes to a spill or incident. And I'll use those terms interchangeably here. Spill implies that a greater level of severity than incident, but as far as I'm concerned, we're talking the same thing here. So our working definition of that manure spill or incident is a release or breach of manure that leaves its engineered place or planned application area. Planned application area, kind of obvious, the field. That engineered place could be manure storage. It could be the barnyard system that's designed to filter out the runoff. It could be a manure tanker. It could be a hose. Basically, anything where we've spent some time and money to design something to contain or hold or move manure. This time around, we did look at feed leachate and runoff because that was becoming a bigger concern. We had a lot of questions. Well, are more problems happening at digesters, at treatment systems? We only had 6 out of the almost 500 incidences we have documented. And we also looked at what's occurring at the dumpster or the frac tank with manure transfer systems as well. In the past, we spent a lot of time reviewing the DNR and county paper files. This time around, there really weren't enough. Everything's electronic. So that's what we were looking at was the electronic records. So we always provide feedback to the regulatory agency as well. And I think it's important to say here that they've made changes over the last 20 years. They've gone from 11 different tracking systems down to four, which is definitely an improvement. I think another big thing is that 5 years ago, we could not pinpoint where 10% of the problems occurred. So I might say tanker tip over on County Highway W in Brown County. County Highway W goes through four different townships. We have no idea where that is. We don't know where it is. We don't know, well, was it a bad shoulder? Was it a curve? Uh, at our recommendation, the DNR really improved their process, and we went from about 10% of the problems to only one where we could not pinpoint the location. So the regulatory agencies have taken this data and improved their processes as well. I will say that at this point, we're not fully there. I've got about 95% of the DNR data in, about 60% of the county. So what we're going to see here is skewed more towards those large farms, those permitted farms, because that's where the records are. As we finish this up, the numbers will change. Today's preliminary. So I'm going to say later that 54% of the problems are from the large farms. That is overcompensated, and that percentage will actually drop. So here's sort of the long-term trend that we see in terms of documented spills and incidences. And what I think is interesting here is some of these peaks and valleys. So we look at 2012, dry spring. We went 7 weeks without being rained out of the field for more than 2 to 3 days at a time. So we weren't rushed, we weren't making bad decisions, and we didn't have runoff. Likewise, 2018, 2019, very wet years. Sometimes we were forced into situations we didn't want to have to do, and that's reflected there. The dip in 2015, 2016 is a shortcoming in the Wisconsin agency's record keeping. We had staff turnover, records were not kept. And so if we start looking at this, the only other thing to add here is the dashed line during COVID. We weren't able to get in and look at the paper records until the second year of that project. And so that dotted line really just kind of showcases that gap. But I think what's interesting here is that if I take out the fact that we had bad record keeping 2015, 2016, I take out the wet fall of 2017 and the 10 more inches of rain that we usually get in 2018 and almost 20 inches more rain than average in 2019. Take out those peaks and valleys and look at the last 5 years, the trend is downward. So I think that it's kind of building on what we talked about earlier, Amber, where farmers are making better choices, they're implementing better decisions. And I think overall we're seeing fewer incidences. Obviously, if it's not reported, not documented, it's not part of this particular data set. So let's dive into comparing a little bit of trends here. So when we look at these pie charts, the top item, which you see here is farm, is in blue. That's in my 1 o'clock position. Going down my list, my transportation is in an orangish color. That's in that 6 o'clock position. And so we go around the pie here kind of clockwise like that. But the thing I want to point out, and my 2020 to 2024 is on the right here, 15.5% are land application runoff instances. If you listen to what the anti-farming community says, if you listen to what we've seen in the past, the problems are land application. No, our problems are transportation focused. Another example of where the industry, farmers, commercial manure applicators have made real positive strides in preventing and dealing with problems. But what it does point out here is that our transportation related issues have grown from about 38% to just over 50%. So this is kind of the next area where farmers, manure applicators really need to be looking at is how do we prevent problems going down the road when I'm moving manure in my hose? So basically, from the time that manure leaves the storage until it gets into the field where it's being applied, that's where we can focus and fix a few things. We'll be talking about that here in a couple of minutes. So just two quick graphs that show sort of the long-term trends here in terms of incidences, where they occur. And I'll point out that that bottom graph, the middle line there in February and March is my land application problems. 15, 18 in February and March over the 5-year period. Go to the top of this graphs here, February, March most recently, less than 5 to 6 per month. So you can see that we are making improvements. The other thing that shows out here is that my peak in land application or transportation problems, the green line in the 2015, 2019 peaks April, May, and again October, November. Once again, several wet falls in there. Compare that most recently in my transportation issues are my April and my October. So those are the times where we really need to be watching things from a land application standpoint. But our farmstead problems, runoff from barnyards, overtopping manure pits, April seems to be a peak, but August and October seem to be a little bit higher and maybe times to watch as well. So, what was interesting when I started pulling this data together this time around, a number of manure applicators said your problems are always going to occur Monday morning, Friday afternoon. What's interesting is we didn't see that. Wednesday actually appears to be uh, the peak for when we see problems. It's not that much higher, though, than Tuesday or Thursday. So let's focus down here on where we saw problems and where we can make changes. So I look at things that happen at the farmstead. And interestingly, manure storage overtoppings were about half of our on-farm issues. The rest included manure stack runoff, so stacking manure the end of the freestall or somewhere around the farm, calf hutch runoff, barnyard, and other storage issues. And so um, just going out there once every week and a half, 2 weeks, seeing how full the manure storage is really critical. There's maintenance needs to be done as well. If the grass is a foot and a half tall, it's hard to see if it's overflowing or not. And so mowing that grass at the top of the berm, looking for differences in vegetation. Occasionally we will see leaks or failures or chipmunks digging through and manure finding its way through. Walking around the outside of that storage in August and looking for, okay, is that grass, that vegetation darker, greener, healthier in a spot could be an indication that there's a problem there that needs to be addressed before it becomes a much bigger problem. Moving on to transportation, what we found is that 22% of all of our transportation issues are truck or manure tanker tip overs. In general, 55% of those occur at intersections, 16% going in and out of the field, 29% going down the road. Now, what's interesting about this is that we look at why. Well, part of it at intersections is going too fast, taking the curve too wide. Um, but the 29% driving down the road, and part of that is sometimes we have to shut down the semis when we're moving from one field to the other and pull off too far on the shoulder and can't get back on. That's been a cause. But I want to take a moment to point out this particular photo. And this is a very, I think, ideal situation that I see here from Kewaunee County, Wisconsin. We have the semi at the left dumping into the dumpster. We have the semi behind with the orange cab waiting. And then the next pair of semis are actually a half mile behind. And if you look uh, down the road here, you see the peak of a hill. The safety recommendation when I'm moving manure in semis is to have no more than two parked together and then at least a quarter-mile gap between so somebody can safely pass, get back into their lane. In this case, the hill there is at that quarter-mile part. So what this farm was doing was as soon as one semi moved forward, they would radio the semis parked on the other side of the hill, and one at a time would come over. So just thinking about where I'm staging my semis, making sure I've got that safety gap, but also thinking about where in the road it makes sense is important. Now, I did break this out looking at everyone on the left versus professional manure applicators on the right. And so basically, the percent of incidents that are truck or transportation tip overs are the same. But I think what's really interesting here is that overall, 55% of tanker tip overs, truck tip overs, are at intersections, but only 32% of the time when it's a professional manure hauler, which means the vast majority of the time it's a farmer that's tipping over at an intersection. Likewise, custom haulers tend to tip over more going in and out of the field driveway. Part of that, I think, is they tend to have larger equipment. Our driveways, the culverts may only be 20, 25 feet long. And so maybe thinking about putting a wider culvert in, extending that culvert can make a difference. So there's a difference in how different drivers handle things. Looking at those tip overs, 25% of those occurred on Wednesday, which was a surprise. I figured Monday, when people are still, quite honestly, sometimes not their full self coming out of the weekend, and Fridays when people were rushing to get things done because they want to go to their kids' high school football game. However, we see with semis in particular an issue with that valve accidentally opening. 45% of those accidental valve openings occur on Monday. 70% on Monday, Friday, or Saturday. So um, it does seem like Mondays are an issue. And so we need to be thinking about how do we prevent those accidental valve openings? And I'll talk a bit more about that here in a moment, but time of day comes into play. And so when I look at when tanker tip overs happen and where they happen, interestingly, things tend to happen 4 o'clock in the afternoon when I'm turning into the fields, 10 a.m. in the morning, and I have more issues over lunch. Well, what's happening here? I expected problems evening when people are tired. I think people are not paying attention. I think they're grabbing a mid-morning snack, a late afternoon Monster energy drink, and I think they're probably eating a sandwich turning into the field driveway. Um, we just need to be very careful. We need to put down our cell phones and focus on the road. Getting back to those accidental valve openings, about half of those occur at intersections. Part of it, I think, is driver fatigue, operator error. The positive thing is those accidental valve openings are down 35%. Part of that is that people realized coming out of the last study, this is a problem. A lot of times those valve switches were put on the gear shift where they could get bumped when downshifting or jake braking. So putting a two-step cover over that, so a cover has to be flipped up. We have individuals that actually got so fed up that the switch can't be opened if the person is sitting in the seat, it's tied into the seatbelt sensor. And so moving that switch where you have to actually have the vehicle stop to reach it does make a difference. So um, we need to be aware that accidents happen, but what steps can we take when we're designing our equipment, modifying it to prevent problems? And obviously, a lot of these are the switches accidentally being bumped. We did have at least one case where the employee got out of the cab of the truck, grabbed their hooded sweatshirt, the hood caught the switch, and they dumped the entire load in the gas station parking lot. And I see you're kind of laughing at that, Amber. It wasn't funny at the time. But just accidents are going to happen. Think about what we can do to prevent those. If it's predictable, and to me, I never would have predicted that one, it's preventable.
And
So,
Kevin, the reason I was laughing is because we've all had that where your sweatshirt or something just gets caught on like an
yep.
edge or snags, and I'm like,
Mm.
I can just imagine how that would feel. And oh, if it's not a good day.
Yep. No, definitely not. Not the type of thing you want to call your boss and say, "Hey, guess what I did today?" So, So I know we have folks outside of Wisconsin here, and I'm just going to share the map that kind of shows where incidents occurred. And we'll talk about the density of farms and where things happen. Uh, Obviously, you look at the map here, and it comes out very easily that, yeah, there's a lot of issues in northeast Wisconsin in that Kewaunee County area. Is that because farmers there are not as smart? No. That's an area where we've had a lot of citizen involvement in the past. Farmers have become much more proactive and probably over-report things that sometimes should not be reported. But in our case, we applied that filter and made sure it was a justifiable issue before we actually uh, documented it. And so I think what this points out is we see differences around the state based on where people are more likely to report. But I also show here the parts of the state where we saw the majority of the rain in 2017, 2018, 2019. And that does correlate to where our incidents peaked. Looking at the southern part of the state, western part of the state, the same thing. We didn't just suddenly flick a switch on January 2020 and become smarter. Weather does play a factor. And part of the weather is we're not able to get into fields that we want to. But part of it, quite honestly, is that when we're rushed, when we're stressed because of the weather, trying to get things done, a lot of times we make decisions that aren't the smartest. We take actual shortcuts we decide on, or just because we're stressed, we take mental shortcuts. And I've seen people drive just a little bit faster because it's going to be raining later today just to try to get the job done. And it's not intentional. It's just they feel that stress. So we look at where problems happen, and I have the little asterisk here on Kewaunee County because we had 61 incidences. The reality is that that's a 30% drop from 5 years ago. So we are seeing across almost all the counties in the state less documented problems than we were before. It's because farmers are taking the opportunity, taking those steps to prevent small problems from happening. And when a small problem happens, preventing it from becoming a big problem. So I do throw this in here to kind of map out the percent of cows in each of the regions versus the percent of the spills that are or incidences in each region as well. And as I said earlier, this is overweighted for the large farms, the CAFO's permitted farms right now, and it will change as we get more data in here. But if you take nothing else home from today, this is the slide that I want you to be looking at here. So on the left is what we've seen in the last 5 years. Who's actually calling the agency and reporting a problem? On the right is the previous 5 year period. So the first thing I want to do is look at that 6 o'clock and that 10 o'clock position on the left-hand one. And if you look at that, it's well over 50% of the problems are self-reported by the farmer or by the for-hire manure applicator. If I look at that pie chart on the right, that same greenish color and the orange in that 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock position as you're going clockwise around, it's less than 50%. So we're seeing a definite increase in farmers, manure applicators self-reporting. But if I look at that blue, that neighbor reporting, if I look on the most recent on the left here in that 11 o'clock position on my clock face, it's around 10%. It's actually a small percentage of the incidents being reported by neighbors compared to the previous 5 years where it was 17, 18%. We're actually seeing both fewer incidences being reported by neighbors and a fewer number of incidences being reported by neighbors. So farmers are being more proactive, manure haulers are. We're seeing less issues that neighbors feel they have to report. But, and here's where I'm going to get on my personal soapbox here a little bit too. If I look in that 2 o'clock position, that upper right, found during inspection. So there's three types of inspections that will be happening with our permitted facilities in Wisconsin. There are during the 5 year permit, one or two permit inspections where you know the DNR is coming. You can have access to their checklist and they're going to walk around and look at things. And then there's manure hauling audits, which the majority of the time are announced. The DNR says during that 5 year period, we're going to come out once while you're spreading manure, make sure the cab of the tractor, the driver has the maps, that you're following the setbacks. The rest of these are a small percentage of complaints. 28% of the incidences, the spills, are being found during inspections. Remember, I said earlier, if it's predictable, it's preventable. So the majority of these, the farm knows the agency is coming. The farm can get access to that very same checklist that the agency person is going to be using when they're doing that manure hauling audit or walking around the production area. And if you just send somebody out with that same checklist 2 days before, you can probably prevent and fix a lot of these problems if they're occurring so that they're not being found during the inspection. And to me, that's huge because that's over 25% of our problems. Whether you walk around 2 days beforehand or what you and I, Amber, were talking about before the meeting started here, maybe sending somebody around once every 2 weeks with that checklist, walking around the farmstead, just doing that informal inspection can pay big dividends.
So, Kevin, I've got a couple questions here in regard to these two different graphs, and one of them is the foundry inspection that you're talking about right now. But why do you think that's increased so much between these two time frames? Because it is a significant jump.
It is, and part of it is that the DNR is doing more inspections now than they used to here in Wisconsin. Uh, so their goal is to do two, at least three, one manure hauling audit, two production area inspections during the 5 year period. That's something that they've made a policy decision to do. They've had some pressure from EPA to do that as well. But the other part of it is, if you remember my line chart where I had a real dip in incidences in 2015, 2016, we saw DNR here in Wisconsin not having the staffing to do their normal jobs, much less the inspections. And so the combination of having the staff now and making it a priority, we're seeing more. The other thing I point out here is that for a good chunk of 2020 and 2021, these were not occurring because of COVID and people not going out on farms. So I would expect if we don't change what we're doing at the farm level, that that percentage found during inspection to increase even more when we look at this 5 years from now.
Okay, so a couple more things off of that. You mentioned that there is the checklist that folks can find themselves online. Is that
Yep.
just if you Google it, you'll be able to find it in terms of being able to utilize this resource?
So there's a number of them out there. My recommendation is to reach out to your specific agency contact and ask for the most recent one because I know there are some older ones out there that are a little bit out of date.
Okay. And then on a different note, when looking between the two graphs, I noticed that unknown is very different between
Yep.
2015 and 2019 to 2020 and 2024. Is that because of the staffing that you mentioned earlier and just kind of that paperwork in between? Because
Yep.
that's
I,
significant change.
It is, and I think that a big part of it is that the agency began better documenting things. But I think also um, farmers self-reporting. We had some farmers that were reporting anonymously, and now they've stepped up and said, I want documentation that I'm the one actually doing it.
That's interesting. I would not have guessed that, but I guess that makes complete sense. And then that kind of leads me to the question of, when talking about this and farmers anonymously versus, stepping up and saying, hey, this did occur on my farm, does that bring more goodwill or does that bring more scrutiny on a farm, depending on who you're working with?
So, without naming names or instances, I'll give you a scenario here. So, you're that DNR person, you get the call from the neighbor saying that there's a problem. You then look bad because you don't know what's going on and you say, I'll have to look into it. You then have to stop what you're doing, call the farmer, go out there, and the farm is now already on the defensive. And the DNR is also a little bit on the defensive as well. Contrast that to where the farmer calls first and says, I've got a problem, here's what I'm doing. If that citizen calls 5 minutes later, now the regulatory person can say, yes, we're aware of it. We're making sure that it's being taken care of. So now that regulatory person looks better in the eyes of the citizens out there. What I'm seeing is the citizens are less likely then to go onto Facebook and say, look at this, the DNR didn't even know what was going on. And so to me, giving and you're already putting yourself in a better light by being proactive. So the idea of self-reporting, and this is only who reports first, the idea of self-reporting, I think, is gaining a lot of traction among the farm community because they realize that in these areas of contention, it does pay dividends.
Hmm. And that's really good to know because I can imagine on both sides, there's very strong reasons why somebody in this quick case would want to, but also I can understand why a producer would be hesitant because it feels like there's more scrutiny that comes down. But it's sounding like the goodwill that that creates with that proactive mindset is really coming to good results for folks who have had that case be or
Yep.
scenario be the case.
And I think if you look at where farmers tend to self-report more in Wisconsin, it's in areas where there's been a lot of public scrutiny in the past. And so that percentage has increased over time because the farmers in these areas where there's been contention realize the benefit of doing it.
That makes sense. I think that's all my questions I have on this section for now. I know I really bombarded you here for a moment, but I'll let you
That's
keep
okay.
going.
We're getting close to the end here. So, um, for the Manure Applicator Association, I did kind of look for them to say, okay, if it is a professional applicator involved, who's actually doing the reporting? Is it the applicator themselves? Is it the farmer? Or is it being documented first by an agency? Say there's runoff and it's reported in. Neighbors are only 3%. So here's an example of where knowing the responsibility to report, being proactive, it is much less of an issue. So what does the DNR find during those inspections? And so we've kind of broken these into transportation, land application, and farmstead incidences. You'll see the spills at WSF Waste Storage Facility and operator error are exactly the same. Semi was overfilled. You didn't have the fill pipe lined up with the tractor tanker. Uh, the payloader missed the spreader and dumped the semi-solid over the other side. Never done that. No, never. Not on the home farm. Those things happen. And so deciding where you're going to fill that and maybe in an area, I've seen a few farms that have paved an area where the semis, the trucks, the tankers are loaded, that any spillage drains back into the manure storage. Fairly simple thing to do, a little bit of money, a little bit of concrete, but it prevents problems. Looking then at that next category, which is the land application in the orange, you see spreading within setbacks being the longer bar there. Well, this is not only, this is not, you're supposed to be 100 feet from the stream and you got within 98. This is, you were closer than the 100 and there was runoff that went somewhere or there was ponding. So there's really two issues that play here at the same time. But I want to focus in the time we have left here on what's happening at the farm. So the two long lines there, feed leachate runoff, failing vegetative treatment area, barnyard runoff, manure storage overtopping, manure stack runoff. Remember that checklist I talked about earlier? All of these things are things where if you're hopped on the gator, the utility vehicle, and just driving around, you should be able to see. And if you see that they're about to happen or they're happening, you can deal with them. And so that's really the take home here is that knowing where your setbacks are and making sure you don't have a problem closer to the stream is important. But just taking that time around the farmstead, around the production area, uh, to really drive around, walk around, and make sure there's not a problem. So we know that about at least half of the manure in the state is touched by a custom manure hauler. They go through safety training every year. We actually offer that to any farm that wants it as well. Um, but the percent of incidents that are being involving a professional applicator is going down. Those folks have the training, and that's a key message here for the farms as well, is that they need to be thinking about training their employees not only to prevent problems, but what to do when a problem happens. So I think what should you as the farmer be thinking about? Well, what information from what we've talked about today is going to help you in your day-to-day job and in your employee training? Take a few minutes after we get done here answering the questions and say, what one or two things can I do really to make a difference? With that, just briefly acknowledge the regulatory folks and others that helped to gather and provide data for the Manure Spill Project. And I'll throw my contact information up here. And it looks like we've got over 10 minutes for any questions that might come in from the audience, Amber.
Well, Kevin, I have to say, going through this, it's got me thinking, gosh, we have really made leaps and bounds in terms of
Yes.
water quality, manure spills and applications, and how to do it correctly and when to call in. So it's got me on a positive when thinking about where we're at. But I also appreciate that, in the slide you showed not too long ago here, that there's still areas of improvement. We're not done
Yep.
yet.
Mhm.
Uh, but that progress can be made in a good light. But when thinking, Kevin, about some of these areas, sometimes it's like, gosh, I can do everything right. And I feel like I am hitting all the nails on the head. And yet, this stuff just happens.
Oh,
So,
yes.
in those cases, what do you want to say to farmers who are like, I'm dealing with weather and I have to get it out in this very small, short window, especially on those years where we're getting excessive moisture levels. And you're like, I just can't do it all, but it has to get done. And so that's when we've seen, like you mentioned in this previous slide, spikes happen. What do you recommend or what do you say to those producers in those moments? Because that is a lot of pressure. You have a
Yep.
very short time to get it out there.
hmm And I think it really gets into some longer term strategic planning. I mean, if we look here in Northeast Wisconsin, starting actually in the 1990s, we would have a few wet years, and that would cause people to think, what can I do to spread that workload out? And so that's when we started to see manure being top dressed on alfalfa fields. And so there are farms in this part of the state where probably close to a third to 40% of their manure is spread during the growing season, top dressed on hay. We have a few folks that have actually gone out with a drag line and applied manure to corn before that V3, V4 stage. And that looks horrible when the drag line has flattened it, but it does bounce back. And so, what can I do to decrease the volume that I have to deal with in fall and in spring? And so that starts off with, can I change my crop rotation a little bit so that I've got some acres I can go out there in August, buy me some capacity if I do get a wet fall? We've got a few people playing with cover crops and a few other things, top dressing on the cover crops, or looking at some in-season applications. At the same time, kind of thinking about the volume of water that we're using in the farm and the volume of precipitation water that's actually going into the storage. So, can that feed bunker runoff not go into a manure storage, but a separate storage that I don't have to deal with the same way? And we have a few people playing with the Rain 360 systems, but even for our smaller farms, looking at how much water we're actually using in the pipeline system itself, adjusting the air injectors so that we're getting the right amount of pulses in there, so we're doing a good job of cleaning. I've seen farms in the past cut their water usage in a pipeline system and a traditional milk house by more than 45%, just by fine tuning what they're doing and not just leaving it the way that it was set up when it was installed 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Kevin, it makes a lot of really good and interesting conversation pieces about the idea of, well, there's always potentially a better way or a new way you can do things. And what does that look like? And that it can be an ongoing conversation and discussion piece and strategic planning point where like you said, what worked 20 years ago doesn't mean or shouldn't mean for a lot of cases that we are doing the same things. But when thinking about, what you were saying earlier with if it's predictable, it's preventable. And a lot of the times for me, when I'm thinking about that, maybe it's because of I'm working with professional dairy producers and I think training and education and making sure everybody understands the risks, the areas that can be prevented. And that comes with training. So for those folks who maybe don't work with custom haulers as much and maybe has their own team that comes in and works on this side of things, especially during those very busy seasons, What training do you really recommend or suggest that they have before going into it? Even if they are experienced, what should they be refreshing on every year?
So I think that goes into a couple of different categories. The obvious one, of course, is knowing your manure spill response plan and what you as the farm owner want the employees to do. I mean, I've seen unfortunately too many cases where the employee was afraid they'd be criticized afterward for doing something and therefore didn't take action, and a small problem got a whole lot worse. So I think that's part of it, having that spill response plan, making sure the employees know where that is. It's not locked in an office, because these situations, despite the data, always seem to happen after hours or when we don't have access to what we need. And so really having that plan, but also the employees knowing and feeling very strongly that they've got the support. If they make the decision to take an action and it's 90% of the way there, but not 100, that they're not going to be criticized after the fact. I think another thing is making sure that the resources and tools are available. That's everything from the phone number for the septic pumper to the actual equipment itself. I remember years ago being on a dairy farm in Minnesota and walking into the shed, and every piece of equipment looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line from John Deere. I mean, the guy probably was waxing his combine. It looked so nice, not a speck of bird poop anywhere. And we're walking out around the back of the manure pit, and there is a chisel plow sitting there next to the manure pit that's definitely not green. And I said, "Well, why is that?" He said, "Well, back behind here's a tile inlet in that field, and I had a chipmunk that burrowed through the manure storage berm. Came out here, and there's a stream of manure shooting in the air about the diameter of a soda can, heading towards that tile inlet that would go to the stream." He said, "Unfortunately, my chisel plow and disc were behind the corn head, the bean head, and a bunch of stuff in the shed. It took my crew 20 minutes to get to it because it was in the back corner." He said, "That could have been a problem. We almost didn't get it stopped in time. So the next weekend, I looked at the auction ads. I said, I'm going to the nearest auction that has a chisel plow. I don't care what brand, what condition. We're going to buy it, and it's going to sit here out in the open where we can hook up to it immediately if we need it." And having access to those tools so that they're there, whether that's, I mean, I've seen people dump solid manure in a road ditch to stop liquid manure runoff. Thinking outside the box, what can I do with what I have available?
I think that's a really good message that, sometimes you don't know what you're going to do until you're in those situations.
Yep.
But there's some situations that I don't want to say are inevitable, um, but there's ones that happen more likely than not for producers.
Mechanical failures are going to
Yeah.
happen, accidents are going to happen. And so sitting down with the guys, the gals around the table in the parlor in the shop and saying, okay, what manure related accidents or problems happened in the last 2 years? And
Mhm.
for everything that they come up, whether it was a broken chain on a spreader, the apron wouldn't close, a valve that wouldn't seal, truck tip over. Okay, if it happened today, what would we do about it? And
Yeah,
just
doing it when
kind
you're
of pick
not in
that
that
out.
high pressure
Right.
situation to have time to think it
Exactly.
through. So, Kevin, I know we're getting to our end of the time that we have with you here today. And so I want to make sure to ask, our last question, which is we've talked about a lot and we have a lot of good things to be thinking about. But after today's conversation, what is that one thing you want producers to be thinking about or actively doing from today's conversation?
So, getting back to what you and I talked about a few minutes ago, if it's predictable, it's preventable. And so, really looking at the operation, looking at what's happened in the past, maybe what's happened to some of the neighbors, and saying, okay, what can I do to prevent this from happening? And then what can I do to make sure that that's not happening? And that what can I do to make sure is getting a copy of one of those agency checklists, designating somebody who will go around the farm on that ATV every week, every 2 weeks, however often you feel it's appropriate, and look at it not from the perspective of, oh, it's the third week of October, it's rained, I've got to get the rest of the silage in, I've got to get the corn harvested, I've got to get manure out, and the vet's coming today. No, take the perspective of if somebody who didn't understand the day-to-day of agriculture saw this situation, would they say, yeah, that's fine? Or would they say, no, that could be an environmental problem. It doesn't look good.
I think that is a great way to end today's episode is what can you be doing to have more prevention in place, especially when it comes to a topic like this, where it not only impacts you and your farm, but it impacts the community around you. And we all know that that's incredibly important to be thinking about. And we generally do. We are trying to be good stewards of the land and the people in our communities, but this is one place where we can really come together and do so on. So, Kevin, thank you so much for your time here this afternoon. I appreciate you coming in, especially having so much good and interesting graphs to be looking at, and really diving into the data that helps us understand what's going on in not only the state of Wisconsin, but just in manure application and kind of some of the mindsets that go on around it. So thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon.
And thank you.
I also have to say, if you are somebody who is watching, I appreciate your time here this afternoon. And if you're wondering what's going on in the world of professional dairy producers, there's always something. That is always happening. And we actually have a really great workshop coming up in April. It's called Dairy Smart, and it's talking about AI and maybe a little bit different AI than what you're used to on the farm. We're talking about artificial intelligence, and going through what does that look like? How can we better utilize the data that we already have on hand? And it is going to be a really good time. It's a computer-based lab style workshop. So you can come, you can learn case studies you can dive into. So get registered and signed up for that one. That's on our website at pdpw.org. But for now, thank you for joining us here today, and we'll see you here Thursday on the Dairy Signal. Bye now.